Before I begin, I'd like to say that personal stories can be some of the hardest things to share. There's something about trying to fit this monumental life event into a neat little speech that somehow seems to fall short. However, I do realize that personal stories are also some of the greatest forms of motivation and sources of motivation. Thus, I've decided to share my own, hoping that you'll take something from it. I remember this moment vividly. It was the night after my 18th birthday, and all I could think about, and I just kept thinking. My thoughts were rushing and my mind was racing. As I was laying there in bed trying to fall asleep, all I could think about was how every day was the beginning of the rest of my life. And yet, here I was, after 4 years of searching, 4 years of somewhat hiding, and 4 years of confusion, I still felt exactly the same. My life didn't really have a purpose, and I didn't really have a direction. As I sat there thinking, I decided to, reach through the darkness and find a pen and scribble and just began writing whatever was on my mind. I wasn't really conscious of what I was putting down, I just did it. And after doing that, I realized that at the center of this whole dilemma that I was having was faith. Before I get into that, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about myself. I was born and raised in San Jose, California, and I'm Muslim. I come from a biracial home. I am multilingual, and unless I was wearing a headscarf when I was younger, I was only occasionally perceived as being Muslim. The first day of class and I had a love-hate relationship because my teacher would always ask me how to say my name. And when I would say Karimah, they'd be like, oh, Carmen, or Kamira, or Karma. And I would stand there and correct them, no, Karimah, no, Karimah, no, Karimah. Anyways, the usual name exercise was usually paired with the where are you from, which I totally didn't mind answering, as I was actually really proud of being half Cuban and half Palestinian, except for this one time when my teacher said to me in front of the whole class, wow, I've got a communist and a terrorist all in one. Bad joke. It's kind of a bad joke, and it was actually didn't feel too good to be labeled in that way in front of all of my peers. However, this brings me to my next point. I grew up going to high school at a time after 9/11. This was a time when a lot of Muslims went undercover. And by undercover, I mean where I once would state proudly that I was a Muslim, my religious identity sort of took a back seat. I was proud of being different, but the media was barraging the society that I lived in with images of Muslim women without voices. And at the same time, I was starting to question my identity and question my faith. Part of that was because my mother is a convert. She converted to Islam several years after marrying my dad. And that proved insightful to me, but it also was a little bit confusing, because it meant to me that no matter how I was raised and no matter what I was taught, at the end of the day, faith is a choice. And I had to make a decision about what I wanted to believe in. So you can imagine the personal conflict that was going on inside me. On one hand, I was, trying to portray my faith as strong, like being strong about my faith, and on the other hand, I was young, impressionable, and curious, and I would always listen to the other side of the story, so the media had an effect on me. While my classmates who ascribed to Christianity were attending youth group and summer camp, I was unknowingly internalizing the media stereotypes about my identity, and that was poisonous to who I was. It was poisonous to my soul. And that takes me back to my 3 a.m. ramblings. I don't know if you recall, but I said it was at night, and that means that it was dark. And when I was writing, I wasn't really paying attention to what I put down. But the next morning, when I looked at the piece of paper, I saw that I had written down a statement in bold. And that statement took me by surprise because it was something that I had never thought about. And that was, I want to wear hijab. For the sake of this conversation, I'm going to use the term hijab to reference the headscarf. Islamically, the term hijab is more than a headscarf. It's a way of life, and it's a form of modesty. But for this conversation, I'm going to use it to mean just the headscarf. So the statement, I want to wear hijab, kind of came out of nowhere, especially because my father, contrary to popular belief, did not force me into it, and my mom herself does not wear it. So for me to have this internal urge to proclaim my faith outwardly was kind of a surprise, and it was telling. Before I go on to tell you the rest of my story, I'd like to emphasize that this is my story. This isn't the exception nor the rule, it is simply my path to faith. So, as I mentioned earlier, my 3 a.m. ramblings took place when I turned 18. A couple weeks after that, I started my journey into college. And that's where it all really began. So throughout this whole time that I was growing up, I kind of shied away from being proud of my identity. And I remember this one moment where I was walking on campus, and I walked past the Muslim Students Association table, and someone called out to me and said, "Hey, would you like to learn more about Islam?" My instinctual response was, "I am a Muslim." And that was the first time that I had said such a thing in maybe 4 years. And the liberation that came with that statement was so motivating that I was like, yeah, I really love this. I really love telling people that that is my identity. And that sort of started the ball rolling and it kickstarted my motivation to follow my heart's desire, to wear my faith literally on my sleeve. 2.5 months into the school year, I had reached a sort of spiritual hiatus. This internal debate that was going on within me about whether or not to wear a headscarf was coming to a climactic point, and I knew that I was going to make a decision at some point. However, this was a time in my life when I realized that I'm kind of a control freak and that I really like to think that I'm in charge of everything that happens. I was in love with coincidences and not so much a fan of fate and destiny and that everything happens for a reason. So you can imagine how the next incident affected me. I was driving home one day and I was mulling over my pros and cons list, and I had narrowed it down to 3 cons. Basically, I really still believed that hijab, if a woman was wearing it, she would be in some way oppressed. 2, I felt that if a woman was wearing hijab, she would not be able to play sports comfortably. And since I was an athlete and an avid soccer player, I couldn't live with that. And 3, I felt that if a woman wore hijab, she would be limited in her job opportunities. I thought to myself that if somehow these 3 things could be disproven, then I would just let go and go all in. So I was driving to work one day and I was thinking about these 3 things specifically. And after having a little conversation with myself, I turned on the radio. As I turned on the radio, which usually would have been tuned to a music station, was somehow tuned to NPR. I don't know how that happened, but it was on NPR. And it just happened to be that the segment was featuring a woman who identified herself as an American Muslim woman. And I don't remember what it was called or who she was or anything, except that her message was, "I'm an American Muslim woman and I am not oppressed." I was like, whoa, okay, that's a little scary, so I'm gonna turn it off because, once again, coincidence, weird, turning it off. So as I reached over to turn it off, I made eye contact with a woman that happened to be jogging across the street. And that freaked me out. Why? Because the woman that was jogging across the street was dressed in full athletic gear and a hijab. So you can imagine the stubbornness inside of me was like, all right, God, if you can only strike out 2 of the cons, then it's not a sign. So I was like, I'm just gonna keep driving to work and not even, trying to brush it off. So as I got to work, I sat down and I started taking orders and answering phones. And as I'm doing that, in walks a woman dressed in professional attire, and she had a Bluetooth sticking out of her hijab. I was like, oh my gosh. And in that moment, I really let go, and I put my trust in, it led me to feel comfortable enough to let go and put my trust in faith and really just open myself up to destiny. And I was like, you know what? Okay, I'm gonna do what I wanna do. I'm gonna stop being afraid of hiding myself, and I'm gonna do it. So shortly after that, I started wearing hijab, as you can imagine, and my life attained direction that I hadn't fathomed it could. Making this decision has really directioned and given me purpose, because I quickly realized that me putting on a hijab and being an ambassador to the world about my faith was the best and fastest way that I could dispel the stereotypes that I choked on as a teen. Basically, me being the role model that I never had was going to be the best way to like live my life. So I started getting involved. Throughout college, I really embodied what it meant to have this purpose. I found my home at a local open mic, and I started using spoken word as a tool to dispel those stereotypes of Muslim women. I became the Muslim Students Association president for a couple of semesters. I worked as the diversity advocate intern, where I hosted various workshops on different forms of oppression. My degree was in social work, so I was meeting people regularly who had never even seen a Muslim, let alone a Muslim woman in hijab, and pretty much every single thing that I was doing, I felt like I was, educating people out there. So it felt really good, and it felt amazing. I guess that's because, to me, purposeful means living your life trying to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And that entails growing and changing and learning and shifting to accommodate the lessons that you learn. But it's a core ingredient for happiness. Without a purpose, it's very difficult to be happy. I'm sure maybe some of you know what I'm talking about. So my hijab focused my purpose in life. And after college, it actually continued to affect me because I went overseas and I worked for a non-government organization in the West Bank of Palestine, where I taught English and I taught Spanish and I coached soccer and what else did I do? I did a lot of stuff. But most importantly, I met a lot of women who wore hijab for cultural reasons. And for them, seeing an American woman who chose to wear hijab, who chose to wear it, was unfathomable. So I thought it was really cool that I was breaking stereotypes overseas as well as globally. Overseas as well as locally. Now, upon returning, I started working as a youth coordinator at my local mosque, and I love what I do. The job that I do basically builds the two cornerstones that, had they been present when I was growing up, might have made my personality crisis, my identity crisis, a little bit easier to go through. I work at community building and youth development. And I teach my kids to be conscious of other people's struggles, to speak respectfully. My kids meaning my youth. I teach them to be conscious of other people's struggles and to be mindful and respectful of how they speak, and to use creative art forms to tell their own stories and to grow. And I live by those rules myself. I really believe that life is like a journey. The first part is you trying to figure out who you want to become, and the second part is you becoming that person. And honestly, the second part never stops. And it's okay to feel lost and challenged throughout it all, because that's what makes you, that's what makes you grow and pushes you to grow. I feel that now I can share with you all a poem that pretty much exemplifies how I've embodied this transformation that I've gone through. And instead of, as a teen, I would sit back and let people speak about my faith, this is now how I would choose to proactively respond to situations of ignorance. And now I'm going to recite the poem. I sit and I turn the pages of my notebooks. I have 3, you see. They sit right here before me, full-sized, half-sized, and tiny. I need to keep them organized, a contrast to my lack of memory. I take a glance and I see I've written on my hand the one spot where I write the thoughts I don't want to risk the chance of forgetting. Life passes too quickly. If I write it on my own skin, it's bound to sink in, and in addition, there's no subtraction when it comes to my limbs, so I won't misplace my ramblings once my mind has reached its brim. But sometimes the best recipe for memory is just silence. And I sit upon my bed and I listen to my conscience. My left brain and right brain just keep asking themselves questions, and you won't believe how many times I've caught my expression in a reflection and realized I must confuse people with all my silent confessions. I try to control my reactions, but my mind is a mind of its own, and as much as I try to focus, there are just too many distractions. Take the sky, for instance, my heavenly obsession. Anytime I'm outside, I take a minute to breathe. The sky calls me, my arms lift like a marionette. But I am not a puppet. This love is valid. I want to hug the sky, embrace it. I said that to somebody once and they looked at me like I had 2 faces, but hey, let's face it, it wouldn't be the first time somebody has judged me. Like this one time I met this one guy in front of a coffee shop, And for some reason, he felt the need to express what he thought about the way my daddy raised me. And I love encouraging people to use their freedom of speech, but in this case, I really felt this man had no authority in telling me how my daddy raised me. Because A, he never met my dad, and B, who was he? But apparently, because I choose not to smoke weed and I like to use my night hours for sleep, he felt the need to classify my life as worthless. He called me worthless. I am not worth this verbal abuse smothered in judgment. No, sir, you may not recognize me, but see, I respect you. I see you. You are flesh and blood. You are somebody's son, and maybe one day will be somebody's sun that shines rays across oceans, leaving messages to your loved ones. See, I gave you a story because I don't know you, while you gave me none. I don't demand your respect because I recognize that I deserve it. Game recognized game, and you, player, are out of service. I see you, though you must be hurting. To lash out and offend me, you're just doing yourself a disservice, and I don't like to dwell too long on lost causes. I just hope you know that I wish you the best because well-wishing is costless. And I have too much else to think about, like what it means to play through the pauses. Sweet, slow sounds streaming like sunset softness, or analyzing deep things like the theory of justice, sitting through hours of lecture just so I can read articles in the school newspaper calling for the repealment of women's suffrage. See, my interaction with you transcends beyond this. You are an example of those barriers with bad placement. Like these walls around school remind me of the West Bank and family that is trapped because of their last name, the last name that has befitted me, and instantly I'm reminded of my father, the man you called into question, the man now deceased for 6 years yet lives through my every expression, the man whose eyes I share, so with every wide-eyed stare I see him, and I pray he can't see what I see because sometimes I feel like he is the one better off no longer being. It's negativity and it has my soul reeling. It's like every time I try to rise up, I hit yet another glass ceiling, but I'll die on my feet before I ever live kneeling. It's proven. Like words and rhymes are seamlessly woven, the theme in my notebooks is overflowing, and as long as there's a chance for me to reap respect, then respect is what I'll keep sowing. I just pray that I stray from contradictions, and as long as there's a reflection that I keep asking myself questions, because dialogue with oneself is worth every session and every confession. It's like meeting with my most personal peer mentor. It's like asking the architect the secret behind the architecture, and I believe the master holds the plan, and right now he said, test her. So I will be tested, and I'll smile at the woman staring at me, even though I never met her. And I'll think of you when she smiles back at me, even if it's meek, because I just broke through to her. So you haven't poisoned me, sir, not with your unsavory words lacking in flavor. You're calling me worthless? No, I determine my value, and your opinion is far from gold and silver. If respect was an army, you'd be its most loyal deserter, and I'll forever be respect's #1 warrior.